The tow truck arrived before Ethan Carter even finished unbuckling his daughter's seatbelt. Its flashing amber light cut across the polished glass walls of Hale Meridian Capital like a warning no one else seemed to hear. Morning traffic still crawled below the tower sunlight, reflecting off steel and chrome, while Ethan stood beside his old silver pickup truck with one hand on the door and the other gripping a folder thick with printed financial reports he had spent half the night reviewing. The truck looked painfully out of place among the black luxury sedans, lined perfectly beneath the executive entrance faded paint. One dent near the rear bumper, dust gathered around the wheel wells from roads that belonged more to school drop-offs and grocery runs than billion-dollar boardrooms. Inside the cab, 8-year-old Lily Carter rubbed sleep from her eyes, clutching the stuffed rabbit she had carried since her mother died 3 years earlier. She blinked toward the tower, still half asleep, unaware that in the next 10 minutes her father's dignity would be tested in front of people who believed expensive glass made them important. A security guard hurried forward, radio clipped to his shoulder, already nervous before he spoke. "Sir, this section is reserved." Ethan glanced at the printed email in his hand. "Consultant access. 9th floor. Emergency board review. Requested personally by legal at 8 a.m. He opened his mouth to explain, but a black sedan rolled smoothly to the curb before he could answer. The rear door opened, and Victoria Hale stepped out without hesitation, heels sharp against the pavement, navy coat moving like armor around her. CEO of Hale Meridian Capital. 42 feared in financial magazines, respected on television, and currently carrying the exhaustion of a company balancing above collapse. She barely looked at Ethan first. Her eyes landed on the truck. Old, misplaced, visible, wrong. "Why is that still here?" she asked. Not loudly, but with the kind of tone that made 3 people move at once. The guard straightened. "He says he has a meeting upstairs." Victoria finally turned toward Ethan, gave him less than 2 seconds, and saw only what pressure had trained her to reject wrinkled shirt, tired eyes, old truck child in the passenger seat. "Tow it," she said. No pause, no question, immediately. Lily sat upright when the metal hook dropped beneath the truck. "Daddy," she whispered, confusion rising faster than fear. Ethan didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He watched the chains tighten around the axle where his daughter's lunchbox, his laptop, and every printed page of the financial warning he had come to deliver were still sitting inside the cab. Victoria was already walking toward the revolving doors when Lily asked the question softly enough that only he heard it. "Did we do something wrong?" Ethan looked at the truck being lifted from the ground, then at the tower above them where 80 floors of polished confidence waited for him to stay silent. "No," he said quietly. "Sometimes people make expensive decisions before they understand what they're touching." 58 minutes later, in the executive boardroom on the 37th floor, a legal director opened page 93 of the merger file, froze, and suddenly lost all color in her face. Around the glass table, directors leaned forward as numbers stopped making sense. A hidden clause surfaced. Voting rights transfer. Debt trigger. Catastrophic loss in under 6 weeks. Panic spread like fire. Victoria took the document, scanned the highlighted margin note, and for the first time that morning her breath caught. Written neatly beside the fatal clause were 4 words. Reviewed previously. Ethan Carter. Victoria Hale read the handwritten note twice before the room fully understood why her expression had changed. The boardroom, designed to project absolute control with its seamless glass walls, dark walnut table, and panoramic skyline stretching across lower Manhattan, suddenly felt too small for the silence that followed. Richard Sloan, the company's CFO, leaned across the table, first impatience tightening his jaw. "What exactly are we looking at?" he asked, trying to sound irritated rather than uneasy. But Melissa Grant from legal had already turned pale enough to betray what she had seen. Her fingers moved back over page 93, then page 94, scanning the footnotes beneath the merger appendix, lips barely moving as she reread the clause no one else had noticed during 3 weeks of internal review. "The trigger date is tied to deferred liabilities," she said quietly, almost to herself. "If this closes under current language, controlling rights transfer after the second reporting cycle." Howard Pierce, chairman of the board, frowned. "Transfer to who?" Melissa swallowed hard. "To North Barrier Holdings." That name landed like glass breaking. Richard sat upright. "That's impossible. It's written right here," Melissa snapped, now unable to hide her panic. Victoria looked again at the margin note, neat handwriting in black ink. Not dramatic, not underlined, simply placed there as if someone had expected no one would listen until it was too late. Reviewed previously, Ethan Carter. She looked toward the far end of the room where Ethan stood near the doorway because no one had offered him a seat when he entered. He had arrived 5 minutes late, not because of his own fault, but because he had been forced to take the freight elevator after security redirected him away from the executive lobby, and because his truck had disappeared before he could retrieve the printed backup files from inside it. His shirt was still plain blue cotton sleeves rolled twice, tie absent expression, unreadable. To everyone else in the room, he still looked like a contractor called in at the last second because legal had exhausted every other option. Victoria noticed something she had missed downstairs. He had not sat because he never intended to take up more space than necessary. "You saw this before?" she asked, voice flatter now, stripped of the sharp arrogance from outside. Ethan glanced once at the document in her hand. "I saw enough to know page 93 mattered more than page 1. Richard gave a short laugh, too forced. That clause passed through 6 attorneys. Ethan met his eyes without challenge. Then 6 attorneys trusted the summary instead of reading the architecture. No one spoke for a second because the answer did not sound defensive, only factual. Howard tapped the table. "Explain." Ethan moved closer, finally setting his worn leather folder down. It contained only 3 loose pages now because the rest of his documents were still locked inside the truck being hauled somewhere across downtown. He asked for a marker instead of permission. Melissa handed him one without thinking. He turned to the digital glass wall and wrote 3 numbers 4618 2.3b. 46 days, he said, tapping the first number. That's how long until your debt covenant resets after acquisition closes. He tapped the second. 18 subsidiary liabilities were hidden under deferred infrastructure maintenance and listed as post-merger obligations. Then the third. At $2.3 billion, the merger price looks attractive because the liabilities appear delayed. But page 93 ties voting control to covenant breach, not immediate debt. Victoria stood slowly, meaning Ethan turned back toward the table. Meaning whoever wrote this doesn't need to own your company today. They only need you to sign willingly, then fail on schedule. Melissa's breathing visibly changed as she opened additional annex pages. "He's right," she whispered. Richard slammed his palm lightly against the table. "No, he's assuming intent." Ethan nodded once. "Then test it. Pull Appendix G and compare line 14 against the Delaware rider." Melissa did exactly that. Her eyes widened almost instantly. Howard cursed under his breath. The room shifted from skepticism to fear in under 10 seconds. Outside the glass wall, assistants moving through the hallway sensed something had changed, because no one inside spoke above a whisper anymore. Victoria stepped toward Ethan fully now, the distance between CEO and outsider narrowing not because she trusted him yet, but because the numbers had stopped obeying her assumptions. "Why weren't we told this before now?" Ethan answered with calm that irritated Richard even more. "I emailed legal 43 minutes after receiving the draft last night." Melissa checked her tablet, searched, then froze again. It went to archived external review. Richard looked at her sharply. How Melissa's face hardened. Because someone marked his domain low priority. That sentence hung longer than anyone liked. Victoria did not look at Richard, but she noticed his hand retreat from the table. "And you still came?" she asked Ethan. He gave a slight glance toward the window where city light reflected against the glass. "You asked for a physical review at 8. I said yes. No complaint. No mention of the truck. No mention that his daughter was downstairs somewhere waiting with no lunch because the lunchbox had been inside the vehicle her company had ordered removed." Howard leaned forward. "If we delay signing, investors walk." Ethan replied immediately. "If you sign, investors own your collapse." Richard cut in, voice harder now. "Who exactly are you to make that call?" That finally drew the attention of everyone because until then no one in the room had asked directly. Ethan reached into his back pocket and placed an old laminated consultant credential on the table. Expired. Folded. Unimpressive, until Melissa picked it up and stared. "Federal Forensic Financial Analysis Division," she read aloud. Howard blinked. Richard frowned. Victoria narrowed her eyes. Ethan answered before anyone formed the next question. "Former senior audit reconstruction lead. Left 4 years ago." Richard scoffed. "Why leave federal work to freelance contract review?" Ethan looked at him only once. "Because some things become less important after a funeral." The room quieted again, not because the sentence was dramatic, but because he said it without seeking sympathy, as though grief had long ago settled into a place where explanation no longer required emotion. Victoria felt for the first time that morning a crack in the pace she had built around herself. Before she could respond, Melissa's tablet vibrated violently with incoming alerts. She checked once and nearly cursed. "North Barriers Council is requesting final signature in 12 minutes. Howard stood. "If we stall, market rumors leak." Ethan nodded toward the screen. "Then stall differently. Ask for clarification on environmental disclosures. It buys 7 minutes and forces them to reopen annex language." Victoria looked at him. "And then ask why line 14 references voting enforcement under debt breach if liability transfer is supposedly non-operative." Richard's jaw tightened. If they answer cleanly, Ethan's eyes did not move. "They won't." Victoria made the decision in under 3 seconds. "Do it," she ordered Melissa. The legal director dialed immediately. Howard moved beside Victoria. Richard remained seated, but his silence now looked less like resistance and more like calculation. While the call connected, Victoria finally noticed something small yet piercing. Ethan glanced at the clock every few seconds, not anxious for himself. Timing? Something else. "Your daughter," she said quietly, surprising even herself. Ethan nodded once. "She's downstairs." Victoria remembered the stuffed rabbit, the sleepy eyes, the truck lifting off the pavement while she walked away. Something unpleasant moved through her chest, but there was no room for it because Melissa suddenly raised a hand covering the phone speaker. "They're refusing clarification." Ethan exhaled through his nose. "Then they know exactly what's buried." Howard muttered, "God." Richard stood abruptly. "We should still close and litigate later." Ethan turned his head just enough to answer. "Litigate with no voting rights." That hit harder than any accusation. Melissa ended the call and looked directly at Victoria. "He just saved us from signing a hostile surrender." Outside the room, assistants had begun whispering because investor representatives were arriving early. Victoria stared at Ethan. The same man she had dismissed less than an hour earlier because of a dented truck and a tired shirt. The same man whose daughter still sat somewhere downstairs waiting quietly while her father prevented a billion-dollar disaster. "Where is your vehicle now?" she asked suddenly. Ethan blinked once, not expecting the shift. "Tow lot, probably Queens by now." "Your laptop." "Inside." Melissa looked horrified. The backup files Ethan gave the smallest half-smile anyone in the room had seen from him. Cloud copy. Habit. Richard leaned both hands onto the table. "This isn't over. We still need a strategy." Ethan picked up the marker again and wrote a single company name beneath North Barrier Holdings, a shell corporation hidden under another shell. Melissa recognized it first and whispered, "No!" Howard stepped closer. "That company dissolved last year." Ethan shook his head. "No. It renamed." Victoria looked from the board to the name and understood suddenly why panic had not left his faceless calm since entering the room, because he had not come merely to point at a clause. He had already seen the structure beneath it. "Who controls it?" she asked. Ethan capped the marker, slowly turned, and answered with a quiet certainty that made even Richard lose color. "Someone already sitting closer to this table than you think." The sentence did not explode in the room immediately. It settled first heavy and deliberate, as though every person present needed a second to calculate whether they had just been accused or exposed. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan kept moving in silence. Yellow taxis below, helicopters above, sunlight sliding across neighboring towers. But inside Hale Meridian Capital, breathing itself seemed louder than usual. Richard Sloane straightened first, forcing out a laugh that carried too much edge to sound natural. "That's a serious accusation for a consultant who hasn't even been in the room 10 minutes. Ethan Carter did not answer right away. He looked instead at the digital merger file still open on the wall, then at the timestamp beside Appendix G, then at the email routing trail Melissa had reopened in the corner of the screen. "It's not an accusation," he said calmly. "It's pattern recognition." Howard Pierce moved closer, tension visible in the way his fingers pressed against the table. "Explain the pattern." Ethan tapped the shell company name he had written beneath North Barrier Holdings. 3 years ago, this entity dissolved under federal review because of layered acquisition fraud. It reopened under a Delaware filing 18 months later under a trustee who never appears publicly. Same signature rhythm, same legal drafting sequence, same debt trigger language hidden under deferred obligations. Melissa looked between the name and her tablet fingers, flying now, trying to catch up to what he had already assembled in his head. "He's right," she said, voice thin with disbelief. "The trustee filing uses a private registry, but the legal formatting is identical." Richard folded his arms. "That still doesn't mean anyone here is involved." Ethan finally looked at him directly, not hostile, not theatrical, just steady. "No. But it means whoever suppressed my email last night knew exactly why page 93 mattered." Victoria Hale stood motionless near the head of the table, and for the first time all morning, her authority felt split between two battles: saving the company and understanding how she had failed to recognize the man now doing most of that work. "Melissa," she said, eyes still on Ethan, who flagged his message low. "Priority." Melissa searched again, brows tightening. "Manual filter, internal override." Assigned to Melissa hesitated because the answer had appeared. Richard saw her face change before she spoke and immediately stepped forward. "This is ridiculous." But Melissa had already lifted the screen. "Finance clearance." Silence returned harder this time. Howard slowly turned toward Richard. "Your department." Richard's jaw locked. "Thousands of emails route through finance review. That proves nothing." Ethan spoke before the argument could swell. "Then prove it later. Right now you have 12 investor representatives arriving upstairs in 7 minutes and 1 hidden control transfer still attached to a live merger file." Victoria made the next decision without hesitation. Melissa freeze signing authority. Howard delay investors. Richard stepped forward sharply. "You can't suspend signature authority without board vote." Victoria's voice changed into the tone the entire company feared. "Watch me." Richard stopped because even now, even under pressure, she remained dangerous when certain. Howard left the room immediately to intercept the investor delegation. Melissa began duplicating the merger archive to a secure internal drive. Ethan moved to the side screen and requested Annex history. Victoria watched him work for 3 silent seconds before asking the question that had begun pushing against her since he entered. "How did you see this so fast?" Ethan did not turn. Because whoever built it expected everyone in this room to read in straight lines, and you don't. No one who has buried debt professionally ever writes in straight lines. The answer came almost absent-mindedly, his eyes moving through legal timestamps, ownership layers, cross-linked amendments. It was not performance. It was muscle memory. He zoomed into amendment metadata and found a minor timestamp discrepancy, 2 annexes inserted after final legal review. Melissa noticed it only after he enlarged it. That wasn't in the draft from Tuesday. No, Ethan said. It was inserted at 2:13 a.m. yesterday. Victoria looked at Richard. He lifted both hands slightly, anger replacing confidence now. You think I rewrote merger language overnight? Ethan answered. I think someone with finance clearance allowed an unreviewed annex upload and expected no one to compare version shadows. Richard opened his mouth again, but a soft vibration interrupted everything. Ethan's phone. Face down on the table lit once. One missed message. Lily. His expression shifted for the first time, not fear, but attention. He picked up the phone and read a short text from the building lobby desk, clearly typed by someone else because Lily had only recently learned to type full sentences. She is waiting near reception. Says she is fine. Victoria saw it because he did not hide the screen. A small stuffed rabbit icon followed the message. For 1 second, the boardroom disappeared behind the simple reality of a child waiting alone in a building full of strangers because her father had chosen duty over embarrassment. Victoria heard again the tiny voice downstairs asking, "Did we do something wrong?" She had answered nothing then. Now the memory hit harder because she knew exactly who had been standing in front of her. "Go check on her," she said before thinking. Ethan looked up. "The annex first. Your daughter first," Victoria replied, surprising even herself. Ethan hesitated, measuring whether the room would collapse if he left. Melissa spoke quickly. "I'll keep the file frozen." Howard re-entered at that exact moment. Investors delayed 6 minutes. They're not happy. Ethan nodded once and stepped away from the screen. As he reached the door, Victoria said, "I'll come with you." Richard looked stunned. Victoria. She did not even turn. Then don't let 6 minutes become bankruptcy. The elevator ride down was silent except for the soft mechanical hum and the distant vibration of phones in Victoria's coat pocket. Ethan stood beside her, posture unchanged, but now she noticed the exhaustion around his eyes more clearly, the kind that belonged not to one sleepless night, but years of carrying more than one life alone. "How old is she?" Victoria asked quietly. 8. She came because school closed teacher conference day. No sitter. And you still came here after what happened outside. Ethan gave the smallest breath that almost became a smile. Your legal team said urgent. The elevator opened into the lobby. Lily sat exactly where the receptionist had described on a low leather chair near the front window's backpack beside her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, lunch still missing because it remained inside the towed truck. She looked up immediately when Ethan appeared and relief crossed her face so naturally it hurt to watch. "Daddy." Ethan knelt before she even stood. "You okay?" She nodded. "The lady gave me water." Then she looked at Victoria, recognizing her instantly as the woman from outside. Not with fear, children often recognized adults faster than adults understood themselves, but with careful curiosity. Victoria felt strangely unprepared. "Your truck is being brought back," she said, the apology hidden awkwardly inside the statement. Lily looked at her for a second, then at her father. "Daddy said people make mistakes when they're rushing." Ethan glanced at Victoria but said nothing. The receptionist lowered her eyes politely, pretending not to hear. Victoria crouched slightly so she was level with the child, an unfamiliar gesture for someone who negotiated billion-dollar contracts standing up. "He was right," she said softly. Lily accepted that answer with the kind of quiet grace children carried when they had already seen enough sadness to stop demanding perfection. Then her eyes moved to Ethan's empty hands. "Did they fix your papers?" Ethan touched her shoulder lightly. "Working on it." Before another word came, Melissa's voice hit Victoria's phone through speaker, breathless. "You need to come back now. We found internal transfers." Victoria stood immediately. "Who authorized them?" Melissa answered. "A dormant vendor account tied to finance approval and an external legal consultant." Ethan's eyes sharpened before Melissa added the final detail. "The consultant is Richard's brother-in-law." Victoria's face hardened. Ethan rose slowly beside Lily. The emotional softness vanished from the air, because now the shape of the conspiracy had edges. Lily, Ethan said gently, "You stay with reception for 5 more minutes." Lily looked between them. More grown-up trouble. Ethan almost smiled this time. Very expensive grown-up trouble. She nodded seriously, hugging the rabbit tighter. Victoria turned toward the elevator, but Ethan stopped only long enough to remove a folded protein bar from his pocket and hand it to Lily. A father's reflex. No speech, no drama, just making sure she ate before walking back into war. Upstairs, the boardroom no longer felt tense. It felt compromised. Richard Sloane was standing near the far wall, speaking low into his phone when they entered, and he ended the call too fast when he saw Victoria return. Melissa had projected transfer logs across the main screen. Howard's face had gone from worried to furious. 3 payments, Melissa said immediately. All routed through dormant consulting authorization. Same week Annex G changed. Richard threw up a hand. Consulting fees are automated. Ethan crossed the room, looked once at the routing codes, and said quietly, "Not these." He pointed to the final line. Manual split routing. Someone wanted no single transfer large enough to trigger audit flags. Howard stared at Richard now without disguise. "Did you think this would stay buried?" Richard answered too fast. "You're trusting a freelancer and expired legal fragments over your CFO." Victoria stepped closer than she ever had before, voice low enough to force everyone else still. "No, Richard. I'm trusting the fact that the man whose truck I had towed this morning has told the truth every minute since he entered this building while you've been sweating since page 93. Richard looked toward the door, as if calculating exits. Ethan noticed it too. "He won't leave," he said quietly. "Not before investor signatures fail." Richard turned sharply. "What does that mean?" Ethan met his eyes. "Because you still need them to sign before noon or your outside account collapses with the merger." That landed harder than anything before because Richard's silence afterward was not defensive anymore. It was fear. And everyone in the room finally saw it. Richard Sloane's silence lasted only 3 seconds, but inside those 3 seconds, the room crossed from suspicion into certainty. It happened not because he confessed, not because he lowered his eyes, but because for the first time in years, the CFO of Hale Meridian Capital had no immediate argument prepared. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His fingers tightened against the edge of the conference table, and the polished authority he had worn through every quarterly meeting began to fracture under something far more dangerous than accusation-documented sequence. Melissa Grant enlarged the transfer ledger again, and the final routing code glowed on the screen like a wound no one could ignore. Howard Pierce leaned both palms on the table and stared at Richard as though trying to understand how a man who had spent a decade sitting 2 chairs away could suddenly look unfamiliar. "Tell me. There's a reason this exists," Howard said, voice lower than anger, because anger had not yet decided what shape to take. Richard looked from Howard to Victoria, then to Ethan, and in that brief sweep his gaze lingered longest on Ethan, not with hatred but with disbelief, as if he still could not accept that everything had collapsed because of a man in a plain blue shirt who had walked in carrying nothing that looked powerful. "This company was already bleeding," Richard said at last, voice tight. North Barrier offered terms that would preserve liquidity. Victoria's face did not move. By transferring control in 46 days, by keeping the stock alive, by burying the board. Howard snapped. Richard turned toward him sharply. You think investors would stay if they saw the real debt exposure? Melissa cut in before he could continue. Then you disclose it. You don't weaponize annexes. Richard laughed once hollow now. You all talk about ethics because none of you had to choose between collapse and survival. Ethan stood near the screen, listening without expression. But when Richard's eyes returned to him, there was something almost desperate there now. And what would you know about choosing survival? Richard asked. You walked in here acting like the clean man in the room. Ethan answered so quietly that everyone had to lean into the silence to hear him. No. I walked in because your legal team asked me to read a file. No self-righteousness, no triumph, just fact. That unnerved Richard more than accusation would have. Victoria stepped forward until she stood at the same side of the table as Ethan, a position no one in the company had ever seen her take with an outsider. Melissa, she said, never breaking eye contact with Richard Locke, every outgoing account tied to Finance Authority. Melissa obeyed immediately. Howard Investor Access stays delayed until internal audit secures the annex trail. Howard nodded and reached for his phone. Richard finally raised his voice. If you freeze accounts now, the market reads panic. Victoria answered with steel. Better panic than theft. He exhaled hard shoulders, dropping not in surrender but in exhaustion, as though the argument he had rehearsed for months no longer fit the room. You think this saves anything? He said quieter now. The debt is still there. Ethan moved closer to the screen and typed 3 commands into the archive system Melissa had left open. He pulled up a second layer of liability scheduling and projected an overlooked restructuring option hidden inside a subsidiary disposal clause. Melissa stared. Howard leaned in. Victoria frowned because none of them had seen it earlier. What is that? She asked. Ethan tapped the clause. Your European logistics branch has a deferred asset category no one exercised because it looked too small to matter. It covers 38% of the covenant gap if separated before quarter close. Melissa blinked twice. That's impossible. It was marked inactive. Because no one linked it to the insurance reserve attached to subsidiary maintenance, Ethan replied. Howard stared at the screen as understanding hit. That cuts the breach threshold. Not fully, Ethan said, but enough to stop voting transfer. Victoria looked at him in disbelief. You found that now? Ethan gave a slight shrug. It was on page 112. The room almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the absurdity hurt 112 pages reviewed by executives, attorneys, analysts, and the answer had sat there behind language no one bothered to understand, because everyone assumed importance lived near signatures, not footnotes. Richard stared at the screen too, and for a moment the anger left him entirely. What remained looked like a man seeing the path he had chosen collapse under the weight of a simpler one he had ignored. Security arrived 2 minutes later, discreet but visible. Not dramatic, just 2 internal officers near the door after Melissa's silent request. Richard noticed them and gave a tired breath through his nose. So this is how 10 years ends. Victoria finally answered with something softer than anger but sharper than pity. No. This is how 10 years reveal themselves. Richard looked once more at Ethan. And you're satisfied. That question shifted the room unexpectedly because everyone heard what he was really asking, whether humiliation would now be returned in equal measure. Ethan did not answer immediately. He glanced toward the glass wall down through layers of reflected skyline as though calculating distance to the lobby where Lily still waited. Then he looked back at Richard. No. Richard frowned, almost confused. Ethan continued, voice calm, steady, carrying none of the victory Richard expected. Satisfied would mean I came here hoping someone failed. That landed harder than accusation because it removed revenge completely. Richard gave a bitter half-smile. You should. Your truck's halfway to Queens because of this company. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly, the reminder striking harder now that the room had changed sides. Ethan nodded once. And my daughter missed breakfast because of it. The sentence cut deeper than anger because he still did not sharpen it. Melissa looked away. Howard shifted uncomfortably. Victoria felt heat rise under the controlled calm she had built all morning. Richard waited, perhaps expecting finally the edge, the delayed bitterness, the moment a wounded man used truth as punishment. Instead, Ethan said, "But if I wanted revenge, I would have stayed in the parking lot." No one moved. Even security paused. "You signed this in 12 minutes without seeing page 93, he continued. "Your company would collapse, thousands of people lose jobs, and your mistake becomes everyone's rent." Victoria looked at him then, not as a consultant, not even as the man who saved the boardroom, but as someone carrying a moral weight she had not seen in corporate rooms for years. Richard lowered his head slightly, the first visible crack of shame. Howard gestured toward security, but Ethan lifted one hand lightly. "Give him 5 minutes." Howard frowned. Why, Ethan answered, "Because if accounts froze midstream, he still knows where external copies are." Richard looked up, startled by the practical mercy inside the statement. Victoria understood immediately. "You'll cooperate?" she asked Richard. He stared at Ethan before answering anyone else. "After everything this morning, you're asking for 5 minutes." Ethan replied simply, "I'm asking for the company not to bleed longer than necessary." That broke something in Richard more effectively than any threat could have. He sat down slowly, requested Melissa's terminal, and began entering account pathways, shell contacts, secondary legal channels, and external draft locations. Every keystroke stripped away another layer of hidden structure. Melissa copied everything. Howard contacted outside counsel. Security remained still near the door. Victoria stood beside Ethan in silence until Richard finished and leaned back like a man who had aged 10 years in 1 hour. There, he said quietly, "North Barrier receives nothing if legal files injunction within 20 minutes. Melissa was already sending it. Howard exhaled hard. "We may actually stop this." For the first time all morning, the boardroom noise shifted from panic to movement with direction. Phones rang, legal teams moved. Investor delegates were stalled again under procedural language. The company had not been saved yet, but collapse had slowed. And suddenly the emotional center returned because Ethan looked at the clock and realized how long Lily had waited. "I need to go downstairs," he said. Victoria turned instantly. "I'll handle the injunction." Ethan nodded, collected his worn folder, and headed toward the door. Victoria stopped him with one quiet sentence. "Your truck's back." He paused. "Damaged." She hesitated because honesty mattered more now. "Rear latch bent." He almost smiled. "Still opens." "Probably." He gave one nod and left. The elevator ride down felt longer because the adrenaline upstairs had nowhere to go now. In the lobby, Lily had moved from the chair to the front window, standing on tiptoe, watching traffic outside Protein Bar wrapper folded carefully beside her backpack. When Ethan approached, she turned instantly and studied his face before speaking, children always reading outcomes before adults named them. Did the grown-up trouble stop? Ethan knelt beside her. Mostly. Did anyone cry? The question surprised him enough that he laughed softly for the first time that day. Not yet. She looked serious again. The lady with the heels looked sad. Ethan glanced toward the elevator where Victoria had not followed yet. "Sometimes people look strongest when they're most tired." Lily nodded as though that made complete sense. Outside, the old silver pickup sat near the curb again, rear latch slightly bent, dustier than before, but present. The lunchbox was still on the passenger seat. Lily ran ahead and hugged the stuffed rabbit against the window before climbing inside. Ethan opened the rear latch, carefully tested it, and said nothing when it resisted once before closing. He was about to enter the driver's side when Victoria emerged through the revolving doors. No assistance, no security, No board presence, just the woman who had ordered the truck removed now standing under the same tower where that order had begun. She stopped a few feet away, the city noise filling the space between them. "We filed the injunction," she said. Ethan nodded. "Then you bought time." Victoria looked at the bent latch, then at Lily buckling herself inside. "I owe you more than an apology." Ethan leaned one arm on the truck door. "Start with the apology anyway." For the first time that day, Victoria Hale looked uncertain. "I judged you before I heard a word you said," Ethan answered quietly. "Most people do when they're moving too fast." She glanced toward Lily, who was now carefully opening her lunchbox as if the world had returned to ordinary shape. "And she still defended me." Ethan followed her gaze. "She's kinder than both of us." Victoria let out a breath that almost became laughter, but emotion caught it first. "Why didn't you make this harder?" she asked. And now the real question finally surfaced, the one beneath everything. Why help after what happened? Ethan looked up at the tower glass, reflecting both of them in distorted sunlight. "Because punishment feels good for 5 minutes," he said. "But if people lose homes because I wanted 5 minutes, that stays longer." Victoria did not answer immediately because nothing she had prepared for years of executive control covered that kind of answer. Above them, 40 floors higher, her board was still cleaning up a betrayal. Beside her, the one person who had every reason to walk away had chosen not to. And for the first time in a very long time, the most powerful person in the building understood that dignity had entered her company in an old truck she almost never bothered to look at. Victoria stood beside the old silver pickup a moment longer, as if leaving too quickly would make the entire morning return to its earlier shape. Traffic moved behind them, horns, distant sunlight now warmer against the mirrored tower that only hours ago had felt untouchable. Through the passenger window, Lily Carter carefully divided her sandwich in half, then held one piece toward her father. Without a word, the small gesture so ordinary that it softened the sharp edges still hanging in the air. Ethan took it, smiled faintly, and broke the piece again so she could keep more. Victoria watched that quiet exchange and understood why his calm had never looked like weakness inside the boardroom. It came from a life where every reaction had already been measured against something more important than pride. "The board wants to offer you a permanent advisory role," she said. At last, her voice lower now, stripped of executive polish. Ethan closed the truck door gently, full time. "Flexible terms. Remote if you want. Direct authority over risk review." He glanced toward Lily, who was now leaning against the window with the stuffed rabbit under her chin, listening even while pretending not to. "I pick her up from school at 3 every day," he said. Victoria nodded. Then no meetings after 2:30. That earned the smallest real smile she had seen from him all day. "You negotiate fast when you need to. Today taught me I should listen faster, too." For the first time, neither of them felt the need to add anything clever after the sentence. Behind them, the revolving doors opened again, and Melissa stepped outside with a folder, but stopped when she saw the stillness between them and chose not to interrupt, leaving the papers at reception instead. Upstairs, the company had already begun rewriting internal controls, freezing fraudulent accounts, notifying counsel, and preparing a statement for investors. But down here, beside a dented truck and a child finishing lunch, the real repair felt quieter than legal victories. Victoria reached into her coat pocket and placed a small white card on the truck hood. "Direct number," she said. "Not assistant, not office. Mine." Ethan looked at it, then at her. "In case page 112 happens again. In case I forget what page I'm supposed to be reading." Lily suddenly leaned out the half-open window and asked with innocent seriousness, "Are you still the lady with the heels?" Victoria blinked, then laughed softly for the first time that day. "Yes." Lily considered that answer, then nodded. "You look nicer now." Ethan actually laughed, then quiet but genuine, and even Victoria accepted the truth in it without defense. A few seconds later, the truck engine started rough at first, then steady. As Ethan pulled away from the curb, Victoria remained standing beneath the glass tower, watching the faded pickup merge into city traffic until it disappeared completely. For the first time in years, the most powerful office in her building no longer felt like the highest place she had stood that day.